This is the Canon FD 28mm f2.8 manual focus lens. It's referred to as the new FD 28mm f2.8. This one can be identified as it has the bayonet mount, which means to lock it to the camera, you rotate the whole lens. Previous versions had a breech mount, so you put the lens on the camera and then rotate a locking ring at the back of the lens. This video is going to be in three parts. Firstly, I'll take a close look at the lens. Then I'll look at using these manual focus lenses on digital mirrorless cameras. And finally, I'll show you some sample images where we can look at image quality. It's quite a small lens. The length is 40mm, the maximum diameter is 63mm, and the weight is 170 grams. The filter size on the front element is 52mm. The minimum aperture is f22 and the minimum focusing distance is 30 centimeters. It was released in 1979 and I can't remember exactly when I bought this one, but it was either 1982 or 1983. Back in the days of film, most people started off with a 50mm f1.8 as I did. My second lens was a 70-210 f4 telephoto zoom, and then I bought this one, and I much preferred it to the 50mm. You do have to sacrifice the stop of light compared to the 50mm f1.8, but I just much preferred it for general photography. These old manual focus lenses went out of fashion when autofocus was introduced on film cameras, because they're quite difficult to use on SLR film cameras. Because of the flange distance, you can't focus at infinity, and any adapter you use needs special optical elements inside. However, when digital mirrorless cameras were introduced, that wasn't the case, and you could use manual focus lenses with a simple adapter that didn't need any optics. I bought this one. It's made by Canon FD, and it's very cheap and it works quite well. These lens mount adapters are purely mechanical and there are no electronics, but because of that the camera doesn't know that there's a lens mounted. And on the camera, in the custom functions, is an option to release the shutter without the lens. You need to enable that. If you don't, then because the camera doesn't know that there's a lens mounted, you can't release the shutter. Exposure is fairly straightforward, but you do need to check your images and check your histogram to make sure the exposure is okay. You basically need to treat it as if you're using aperture priority mode. So make sure this ring is in the open position, then you can turn the aperture ring to change the aperture. As you do that, you let different amounts of light into the camera, and the camera should measure that light and then set the appropriate shutter speed and ISO if you're using auto ISO. I normally use the camera that I'm taking this video with, the EOS M6, and that's a lot easier to use with manual focus lenses than this one, the original EOS M. And also focusing is a lot easier on the M6 because of the focus peaking feature. Focusing on this one is quite tricky. With the EOS M6, once it goes into manual focus, you get focus peaking. You can change the colour. I've got mine set to red, and all you need to do is to turn the focusing ring until your subject goes as red as possible, and then you know it's focused. What I'll do now is let you look at some sample images and you can assess image quality of this lens. I'm going to do some pixel peeping today. It's not something that I usually do, and it's not something I like to do, because that's not how we use lenses in real life. In real life, we all know that lenses hit a sweet spot around f8, and when we view images, we view the whole image. If we open up a lens to its maximum aperture and then pixel peep in the corners, we know that there's going to be a big degradation in image quality. So what's the point? But anyway, that seems to be how most people like to do lens reviews these days. This is a 100% crop in the centre of the image, taken with an aperture of f2.8. It's not bad. This is the same part of the image taken with an aperture of f8, and as you can see it does look a bit sharper, but that was quite easy to predict because, as I said before, most lenses do hit a sweet spot at around f8. This image was taken at f16, and as you can see we've now lost a little bit of the sharpness. So the best thing to do with this lens, provided you've got enough light, is to stay as close to f8 as you can. Now let's look at a 100% crop in the bottom left hand corner, and this image was taken at f16, and it's okay, not fantastic, but okay. This is the same part of the image at the optimum aperture of f8, and you should see a small improvement in sharpness. Now let's go to the maximum aperture of f2.8, and as you can see this image looks horrible, but that was very predictable. If you open up a lens to its maximum aperture and then pixel peep in the corners, the image will indeed look horrible. The bokeh on this lens isn't great. It tends to blow out bright points in the background, and these very bright points then become quite distracting. It's not the worst bokeh I've seen, but it's certainly not the best. So although this lens does have a maximum aperture of f2.8, it's best to try to avoid using it if you can, provided you've got enough light. If you can stick to around f8, you'll get much better results from this lens. Geometric distortion is actually very good, with virtually no barreling or pin cushioning, and with images from this lens I didn't have to do anything to correct the distortion in post-processing. Street photography is not easy with manual focus lenses. If you're taking shots of stationary images and you've got the camera on the tripod and you've got lots of time to mess around with the focus, it's quite easy. Out on the street, things tend to happen very quickly and focusing can be a real problem. It's actually easier with this lens than longer lenses because this lens has a much deeper depth of field and your focusing doesn't need to be quite as accurate to ensure that everything's in focus. Here are a few more images taken with this lens, and I'll repeat the point I made earlier. If you just use the lens for normal photography and try to keep the aperture around f8, the images will be fine. However, if you insist on taking images of lens charts, you open the lens up to its maximum aperture and then you pixel peep in the corners, you're going to be disappointed. It wasn't an expensive lens and you just need to be realistic about its performance. I took a lot of images with this lens back in my film photography days, but there's not much point analysing them because back then the weak link in the chain was the film, not the lens. Not only have digital sensors been good for cameras, but they've also been good for lenses. With digital sensor resolution now being so high, manufacturers have had to up their game with lenses to make sure that the image quality stays on par. In summary, this is still a nice little lens. With modern technology, it's very easy to highlight its flaws, but if you use it within its limitations, you can still get some very pleasing images. I hope this has been useful. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. And if it has been useful, please consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks for watching.